Hi everyone and welcome back. Okay, I'm just about to start painting this pencil and wash scene of the sunny street scene, but before I do, I thought we'll just have a little talk about it first, because a couple of people have asked me about, do I draw differently when I'm doing a pencil and wash as opposed to a finished graphite drawing? And the answer to that is basically yes, I do. You can kind of see the differences here, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, I'll just quickly mention that I didn't actually film any of the drawing of this. What I actually done was I traced it from this, my original drawing, and I just enlarged it slightly because I'm going to be working on, I think is it 10 by 7, 10 by 8 Langton Prestige. And what I'd done was I put this through the scanner and printed it out in a slightly larger size, just on some printer paper, and then I put the printer paper onto the light board, put the Langton Prestige on top, and just traced the outlines of everything onto this paper. And then once I'd got the outlines, I taped this to the drawing board, and I set about putting all the detailing and all the tones and the textures and everything. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. How I got these textures. I can show you very quickly. If you've watched the video to this, you'll already know, how to draw this out and some of the techniques that I used. But they do differ in this drawing, and that's what I'm going to show you. In fact, it's very, very easy. You'll find this so easy to draw compared to that. Even though that's on a slightly rougher paper, this is on a really rough paper compared to cartridge paper. This is, well, it's not the rough surface, this is the cold press, which is the medium texture, but still, compared to, your average drawing paper, this is really rough, really very rough for drawing and getting fine detail and things like that. In fact, you'll probably find that when you're actually doing very small details and things like that, that your pencil will actually be kind of slipping one side of the bump or the other as you're trying to draw a straight line. So really fine detail on watercolour paper is a bit tricky, but getting all the textures and everything is so easy because we've got the texture of the paper to work with, and it's a beautiful texture for getting textures in graphite. Struggling for words again tonight. These kind of foliage techniques and this texture in here on this wall are so easy to get, they really are. And the detail around the doors and the windows, the stonework and everything, really, really easy. Okay, so let's just take a look at the differences between the two then. I mean, just looking at a distance there, I'll get you close in just a minute, but just looking at the two side by side, you can see a big difference, can't you, straight away? You can see that this one has all the light tones, all the light mid-tones in there. It's obviously far more finished, far more polished looking. It's a finished drawing, everything's there. Whereas this one, it doesn't look quite so finished, although it looks more contrasting. Some of the tones are more contrasting than on here because we've left out a lot of the light to light mid-tones, and that's to allow for the watercolour. It's pointless shading this building in to this level because it's going to get lost with a wash of watercolour. It's the same on these rocks here, look. If I let me just get you in nice and close with these, just so we can draw some comparisons. Can you see the difference there with the rocks? Look, even the foliage, how there's more white paper showing on this one, whereas this one is more covered with lighter tones, lighter mid-tones, and it's completely covered. Whereas this one I've left a lot of paper showing, and I've only really included, well, I've certainly included the darkest tones, the darkest of the dark tones there, and then a very dark sort of mid-tone to suggest the rest of it, and the rest is white paper. So I've only really kind of worked in three basic tones for the watercolour version. I've made a few changes as well, like I've not actually shaded the window in there, whereas I did there. I might do that in dark paint, but on the colour reference photo of this, that actually looks like a medium blue colour, so I might try and get that like that with the watercolour. And also on the distant buildings there, I've gone a little bit more detailed on the watercolour one, whereas I've left this a little bit softer. This is nothing to do with the pencil and wash technique, that's just me and my artistic licence, I guess. I'm just trying a few different things out, thinking maybe if we sharpen the detail up on this building a little bit more, it might draw the focus into it a little bit more. And something else as well you'll probably notice as well, if I just put them down, like I say, this one is bigger, and what's happened is when I ran it through the printer, it chopped off the edge of the door there, as you can see. Let me just bring that into the frame. Look, we can see the edge of the door there, it's lost on that side, and the same here, we can see more of the edge of the wall on this one, whereas it's kind of cropped it closer. I thought, oh dear, I better do that again, but then when I looked at it, I thought, actually no, that I like that frame better, because as it closes everything down, it brings more focus to this. You know, as it's closing that down, that becomes sort of bigger. And I just liked the composition a little bit more. You know, the way that the door was kind of half missing and the wall was a bit missing there. It just kind of focused everything in a little bit more. So I've left it like that. But again, that's nothing to do with pencil and wash or anything like that at all. You know, that's just to do with my own personal taste. But you can see the main differences there. Look, I've allowed a lot more paper to show through on the watercolour version, and that's to let the watercolour do its thing. You know, it's like I said, there's no point in putting all those light tones and mid-tones in, although you can hardly help that sometimes, like on the frames of the windows and things like that, where I've gone in to create the texture and I've blended a little bit, I've just automatically created a few lights and mid-tones there, just, you know, purely by accident. Whoops. So it's kind of unavoidable sometimes, although if you get too much of it, you can always do what I done and go in with the kneadable eraser and just tap out some of those lighter tones just to expose more of the paper. Now it's a bit of a funny term actually, pencil and wash, because you might be thinking, well, when I do watercolour, I use a pencil to draw the outlines of the subject in, and then I use watercolour, so isn't that pencil and wash? Well, I guess you could call it pencil and wash. I mean, you could call it line and wash, but I guess I'm confusing the issue even more, because line and wash is more related to ink pens, you know, doing those line drawings, and you're probably saying, well, isn't that ink and wash, isn't that pen and wash? I know, it gets so confusing, doesn't it, all this terminology. But basically, you know, what we mean when we're talking pencil and wash is we're allowing the pencil to be an integral part of the painting. It's not just an outline for us to work within, you know, just to kind of fill in with watercolour. We're actually using, you know, these textures underneath the layers of paint to show through and be part of the picture. Now, that's the general idea of pencil and wash. You can go further than that and more or less cover up the pencil work. Now, I've done that sometimes, because sometimes just putting a light wash on certain things, hoping that the pencil will do all the work for you and just a glaze over it, sometimes it's not quite enough. Sometimes you almost do have to go back in with some very dark tones to get the contrast, and you will lose your pencil work, and that's okay. That's okay. But the intention is to not do that initially, but be prepared to, if you have to, you know, if the picture needs it, hey, you know, it needs it, we've got to do it, we've got to strengthen those tones up to get the contrast. I mean, I might even go in with a black pen after the watercolour on this one. We'll see how we go. But, you know, the idea of pencil and wash is, you know, the clue's in the title. It's basically an almost full-on pencil drawing, not quite as full-on as a finished graphite drawing, but it's pretty full-on. You know, we've got everything in there except, you know, the really light tones I mean, we've actually got light tones here, look, for the shadows, but I will be going over them with watercolour, and it'll all look like one tone there, and we can adjust the value of the tone a little bit with the watercolour, you know, over some of these tones that we've already drawn in. But generally, where we've got detail, we try and go for high contrast, like on the plant pots, for example. I've used, well, the darkest pencil I've used on this is the one I'm holding actually. It's a 2B pencil, and then I've used an HB pencil and a 3B pencil. A 3H pencil. And that was a 3H pencil there on the lightest of the lightest tones, you know, just for the shadows and things like that. But the contrast here, look, I've left the white paper showing on the light parts of the plant pot, and then really dark on the shadow part. Now, let me just get these close, and it'll be easy to actually see if I do this. You can see there, look, we've still got that contrast there. We've got that dark shadow on the left, graduating out to a lighter part on the left there. Although it's not white there, we've still got the contrast. But on this one, it literally is black and white. Can you see that? So I've omitted all of these light tones and mid-tones and just really gone for a stronger contrast. And those light tones and mid-tones will be taken care of with the watercolour. And that's allowing the space there with that white paper for the watercolour. That's the idea. That's the idea. Doesn't always work, but but that's the idea, and that's what we try for. Okay, it's okay, my board's at an angle and these keep slipping down, so I've got to make sure that they don't fall. That's it. Now, with all these things, it's always a good idea to have a bit of a plan, you know, before we start. You know, and with a pencil and wash drawing, you've got your plan really laid out there. You know, we know exactly what we're doing. And this is really halved the work with the watercolour. It really has. You know, we've got all the detail there. We don't need to bother with any more detail. We don't need to bother too much more. I won't say completely, but too much more with tones. You know, the watercolour is just going to give us the colour and give us the life, hopefully, in the painting. But the plan is, you know, to go in with light washes to start with, and to use this layering approach, which I use for everything, even graphite drawing. You'll notice, you know, I tend to work in layers. I'll start with a light layer, then I might add a little bit of texture in there, then I might blend, add another layer, and things like that. Whereas some people with graphite, they just go in with one hit, bang, done. I don't like the look of that. I like that layered look, because things get sort of lost and found. You get that those lost and found edges. You get this kind of lovely texture. You know, instead of just trying to create that all in one go, which I see people do, I like to kind of blend it a little bit, lose it a little bit, then bring it back a little bit with other layers, and you just get this certain look, which I think looks a lot better than just trying to get everything done in one sort of shading session, you know. And it's the same with watercolour, and it's also a safe bet with watercolour, because if you go in and try and get it with one hit, you know, try and get that colour perfect and the tone perfect, and in you go, it might be wrong. So you're not necessarily going to ruin your painting, but you're going to have to probably sponge it out and, you know, start again and all that kind of stuff. But if you use the layered approach and use glazes, someone's going to ask me what's glazes now. Well, a glaze is very, very weak watercolour, just tinted water applied over the top of another colour, just to adjust it. It can be the same colour you go over with. We'd probably call that a wash, because it's not actually glazing. That's probably just strengthening the tone. You know, so the difference between a wash and a glaze, well, there isn't one really, but a wash, you know, generally is a thicker wash of paint. It can be the initial layer, it can be a second layer, but whereas a glaze is to still kind of leave what's already on the paper, the colour that's already on the paper, but just adjust it slightly, maybe cool it down, maybe warm it up, and you know, and by doing that we can adjust the depth in a picture as well. For example, if we make these shadows a little bit too warm, we can glaze them with a cool blue, like maybe a cerulean blue, or some kind of just any cooled blue. We could just glaze over the colour just to cool it down a little bit, and that'll set it back more into the distance. Whereas maybe the shadows on here, if we got them too cool, we could just warm them up a bit with a very, very weak wash of a cadmium red, or actually one of the colours I'm loving at the minute is the Pyrrole Orange. It's a wonderful glazing colour, very, very strong. But the same principle applies to that. You know, a very, very light, watery wash, almost like weak tea, you know, without any milk in it or anything. A very, very weak tea. Or a very, I mean, it can be anything from like a lager kind of colour, you know, very, very pale wash, to something that will almost cover it but not quite, but still allow the subsequent layers of watercolour to show through. So again, you know, we could bring this more into the foreground by glazing this a little bit warmer and glazing that a little bit cooler. So that'll help us a little bit more with the atmospheric perspective, the aerial perspective there. And also it'll help to balance the tones more as well, and it'll give you a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance, even a fifth and sixth chance, you know, depending how light you put the watercolours on. Don't worry about going muddy with things when you're layering with light glazes, because you can apply a lot of glazes before it gets muddy if you're keeping them nice and transparent, and you're not how can I say this? You're not going from one extreme to the other, like you've not put a green down there and then you go in with a blue, and then you go on with a yellow, and then you go on with a brown or something. If you keep really going like that, you will eventually end up with a very dull looking area of watercolour, whereas glazing really can really bring things to life, because what happens is your first layer that's on the paper there, when it's dry, and you go over it with a second layer, it's like looking through a stained glass window or something. These layers kind of build up, and as the light passes through them, you can kind of see the layers underneath. There's kind of a life, I can't explain it too well, but there's kind of a life to glazing, which you can only get with glazing, and not just that one layer of watercolour, although that looks very clean, very transparent, and can look very vibrant and all that kind of stuff. That glazing approach adds something different. It's very unique, you know, when you build those layers up. So that's what I'm going to try to do with this, you know, without losing, you know, too much detail. But I can honestly see, you know, me going over this with maybe a lighter green, then a darker green, and maybe even a black pen to really get in there and bring some of these darks out. Because what happens is the pencil, you know, although we've got the contrast there now with the dark pencil, the pencil itself can actually lose that contrast once the watercolour goes on. You'll probably notice that when you do a pen and wash or an ink and wash, you've got your black and white drawing there in front of you, and as soon as you go over it with the watercolour, it tones the black down. It sits on top of the black and just kind of tones it down a little bit. And the same happens with the pencil. You know, the watercolour will sit on top of that and just tone it down a bit. So we're going to lose some of the contrast, so we might need to actually, you know, be prepared to put some of it back in again at a later stage of the painting. Another thing you'll notice as well, I've completely left out any detail or any tones in the sky area. I never, well, I say never, I haven't yet, that I can remember, have I ever? No, I don't think I've ever actually drawn a sky in and then gone over it with watercolour. I just let the watercolour do the work in those areas. At the end of the day, you know, it is a watercolour painting. That's what we're focusing on. It's not a drawing, it is going to be a painting. So again, leave that space there. I mean, the watercolour skies are beautiful. We don't need to draw anything in unless it's really complicated shadows and things like that, which would probably be best if you used your artistic license and just done them in watercolour anyway. But if you really wanted to, you could draw a sky in like that if you wanted to, but I always prefer to leave that space purely for the watercolour. Okay, so what I'll do now, we've had a bit of a talk about that. I want to show you now how I got some of these textures on the paper. Okay, so I've got an A4 piece of Bockingford here, and there's the drawing I'm going to use. Now, to create this texture, you know, if we imagine that we've got the the wall there, all I've done is with a blending stump, I've rubbed it in some graphite, and I've just gone along tapping, making little dots, little dashes, and I've just gone over that area like that. Keep rubbing that in some graphite because it kind of gets lighter as you're using it. This looks a little bit too obvious at the minute, but I mean, even that doesn't matter. That's you know, if you were using a darker watercolour than we're actually going to use there, you could certainly leave these darker spots and it really wouldn't matter. But that's how I achieve those tones. I mean, how easy is that? How easy is that? I mean, that's just simplicity itself, isn't it? And we're getting various tones there. Look, from light to dark, depending if, you know, we spin the blender a little bit there. If they are too dark and you don't want them that dark or that big, just dab them with the kneadable eraser and they'll tone down. That's it. That's all there is to it. Okay, so what other textures have we got? Okay, the foliage textures. So, with an HB pencil, this is quite a dark HB pencil. Actually, I'll probably use more like a B or something like that, or even a 2B if you want to. Now, we can get some really nice textures just by using the pencil on the side. And literally within seconds, we can, you know, something like that, we can almost draw that bush in. But obviously this doesn't look like that. But you can, you know, leave it like that if you want to. Or we can actually, well, we can go back in with it, you know, darker tones, a little bit more pressure, and kind of put the dark tones in there. And, you know, just with the side of the pencil, in a lot of cases that's good enough. Or we can actually draw like we're drawing on cartridge paper and do a little bit more of a squigglism technique there if we want to. And be a little bit more precise, or a combination of the two, whereas you'd probably just kind of do what I've done like that with the side of the pencil, then go back in and start to just work on. I mean, it's a little bit obvious, some of the texture there, isn't it? It's an obvious kind of paper texture, and just maybe start to just shape things a little bit more with a little bit of squigglism over the top. And then to get those lighter areas in there, again, it's just with the kneadable eraser. That was too wide, I'll just make that a little bit finer there. We can just go in and just reveal a little bit more of the white paper to allow for the watercolour. You can also use, where is it? I've lost my pencil eraser. What have I done with that? Oh, there it is. You can also use, you know, your pencil eraser, just get finer detail in there if you want to. But you'll find, you know, this is very, very easy to get these textures. The same on here, exactly the same thing I've done there, I've done on there. And this is just literally drawn in. It's just little dots, little squiggles, and the shapes of the branches, little random leaves on the outer edges and things like that. That's all that is. It's very easy to do. And I use the same technique for that I did on the pencil drawing. It'd probably take too long to demonstrate that again, but it's basically you just kind of shade in the shape, the outer shape of it like that, and you go in with the eraser and you pull out a few shapes, and you go back in again and kind of make sense of them and start to just darken up around them a little bit. And just kind of blend a little bit with the blender there, and again overlap them a little bit if you want to, put some more leaves going that way, and just keep going in and working in and around them so it looks like that. You can see how that, you know, it's a very rough version of that. But that's how I've done that. Now the rock textures or the stone textures there, you know, if we get a quick outline in something like that, a couple of things you can do. You can again, you can, let's just put the bottom part, again we can just very lightly, nothing like the same pressure as that, but we can very lightly just go over it, look, with the side of the pencil, not the point, just the flat part of the lead, just dragging it over the surface a little bit, just kind of randomly, and then again with the blender, just very random, just kind of squiggly bits on there, like blended areas and things like that. And then with an HB mechanical pencil, something with a bit more precision to it, we can start to get a little bit more precise. Start getting a little bit more picky and choosy now with where we want some of these marks to be. Just to create that texture, and again just blend them a little bit, and you can see, look, I'm accidentally creating all of these light mid-tones, and eventually that paper is going to get completely covered over. Now you can leave it like that if you want to, you know, or we can go back in again and just create a few lighter areas, or even just dab a little bit with the eraser just to free up a little bit more white paper there. You can see the difference there with those two, just to free up that little bit of extra white paper, so we've got again room for the watercolour, you know, to sort of do its thing. Not that the watercolour won't do its thing over these dark areas, it certainly will, that's for sure. In some of the really dark areas though, if you know, we're talking some of these dark windows and everything, you know, where it's not graphite like that with texture showing, it's actually a solid dark shaded in area. Watercolour will have a bit of a job to get in there, and it will bead up on top, but eventually what will happen is the water will soak in there, it will get in there eventually. You just have to keep working it a little bit with the brush. As soon as you see those beads starting to happen on there, just get the brush and just kind of work them in a little bit, and then when we look at this, we might want some more, you know, darker tones. Just keep layering up, you know, and just introduce those little low lights and the little highlights, and try and plan everything for the watercolour being the mid-tone. So it's almost a full-on drawing, but we're just omitting the lighter tones, the mid-tones, and we're focusing more on the low lights and the highlights. And then we've just got one general mid-tone, and whatever happens with that happens. You know, if we create variance in tone, you know, it happens, that's it, just go with it, just go with the flow. If it happens, it happens. You know, it's not the end of the world. If your drawing did turn out, you know, on watercolour paper to look like the finished drawing, I would still paint over that. Although, you know, it's like I say, it's pointless to do the shading on the building, because that's just going to be one simple wash of watercolour, you know. And we've used the texture on here to our advantage, whereas we didn't have the luxury on here, so things are going to look a little bit different anyway. But you can do a full-on pencil drawing, completely full-on, as you would want to if you were just going to leave it in graphite and then watercolour it if you want to. Not my choice. I prefer, like I say, to leave that space, leave more white paper and go darker and get more contrast. Be looser, be a little bit more random as well. You don't have to be so precise, you know, on the watercolour paper. In fact, you probably won't be able to be so precise on the watercolour paper because of the texture on it. You know, if we look at the precision, yeah, you can see a big difference, particularly in the foliage. I mean, this really doesn't make sense in some parts, whereas this one, it's a lot tidier, it's a lot more refined. If I hold those together like that, and we just look at, you know, this area of rocks and the foliage, although this has got more contrast, this is a lot more refined, a lot more finished looking, a lot more natural, more realistic. You know, whereas this one really looks like a drawing. There's no realistic tonal work there or anything. It really looks like a drawing because we've got that high contrast, black, white and one mid-tone. We haven't paid any attention to, let's say, the realistic tones there, all the tones in, all the little subtle tones in between. We haven't paid any attention to them whatsoever in the pencil and wash. We've kept it really as a contrasting drawing. Okay, you can even, like I say, leave out the shadows on this building if you want to, but for the sake of drawing this in and having something to work to, I found it easier just to lightly shade them with a 3H. It helps me visualise, the picture. The same there, I use a little bit of 3H on there as well, just to tone that down a little bit darker than that. It just helps me visually, although if you don't want to do that, the watercolour will take care of that. No problem at all. So this stonework texture here is exactly the same. I'll bring this down so you can see it side by side again. It's exactly the same as what I've done on the door frame, same as the rocks, door frame, window frames. This one, the archway, is a little bit more subtle. There's not quite so much texture and contrast there because that's how it appears in the reference photo. So I was just kind of trying to be faithful, a little bit more faithful to the reference photo there. Whereas if you look at the reference photo here, in these areas, you'll notice that I've gone a lot darker and a lot lighter. Again, more texture here than you actually see in the reference photo, because again we've got to allow and try and visualize the effect that the watercolor is going to have on this before we apply it. We know it's going to have a balancing effect, a leveling effect, a subduing effect, if you like. We're going to lose what's underneath it. So we are going to lose some of this texture, but not all of it. Some of it is still going to show through. And obviously that's the idea of the pencil. It's the integral part of the picture. So we want some of it to show through, but some of it, particularly the lighter tones, will get lost and it will all tone down a little bit. So that's why we go in and we kind of ramp up the dark areas a little bit more, allowing for the fact that the watercolour will tone them down a little bit. But you can see, very, very easy, look, to create these textures. Very easy indeed. And the fact that I've literally redrew that scene, it took me a fraction of the time to do that. I think the other one, that probably 10 hours, 12, 15 hours. I wasn't really timing the other one that I'd done, but I'm guessing around the 10-hour mark. I mean, this one, probably 2.5 hours from start to finish, probably not even that. You can see how fast these textures were created here. And it's not going to take much more now to build on this and get a finished picture. It really isn't. We can soon start to, once you've got the outline in. And that's another thing. Trace your original drawing if you want to, or just trace the reference photo. It doesn't matter, if all you want to do is the watercolour pencil and wash side of things and you don't want to do the full-on pencil drawing, that's absolutely fine. That's why I'm doing this twice. So you've got a choice there. Just trace the line drawing if you want to. I won't tell anyone. I say that as if there's something wrong with doing that. There's not. A lot of people think there is something wrong in doing that, and I wish people would get over that hangover, because there's not. There's not. Just because I use a grid method, and you see a lot of other artists using a grid method or drawing freehand, and not many artists are brave enough to show the fact that they actually trace. And a lot of top art, I can guarantee you now, a lot of the top artists out there are tracing their work. I know for a fact. This is not gossip or accusing people. I know for a fact. If you ask them about it, they will admit to it, but it's not something they're very forthcoming with their, with their drawings on YouTube and things like that. They don't advertise it all the time, but it's obvious that's what they're doing. So they do feel some sort of shame in doing it, which I wish they wouldn't. I wish everybody could get over this hurdle. Some people say, it's cheating, it's this, it's that. It's not. It's not cheating, it's called tracing, That's all it is. You know, and if light boards and things like that were around in John Constable's day, they'd have been using them too. In fact, there were similar kind of projection systems that they used to use with candle lights and all this kind. I've seen images of them in books, how they used to actually trace round shadows of things, all this kind of stuff projected through these kind of candle light things. So they were, and they also use grid methods as well. So they were using every trick in the book. You know, these great masters' works that you look at. You know, an artist has not just put his canvas there and just painted that out, and hey presto, you know, a masterpiece. No, there's been months of preparation there. There's been grid methods used. All sorts of techniques have been used, you know, in most of those paintings. I'm not saying every one of them. I mean, some artists do just literally get the canvas out and just paint a masterpiece straight off the bat. But there's nothing wrong with tracing. Nothing wrong with tracing at all. You know, if you've been struggling to draw outlines and things like that, even with a grid method, every now and again it's going to do your confidence the world of good to just trace that outline and then shade, do your textures. You know, you might be really good at tonal values and texturing and things like that, but you may not have the hang of line drawing yet, in which case you are, you know, a prime candidate to trace. You must trace, because you'll lose confidence. You know, you've got all these skills to do the tonal work and the texturing, and you might be doing it on a bad foundation of a bad line drawing, and you know it, and you're not happy with it. But maybe you feel inside that it's wrong to trace and you mustn't trace. You've been told it's wrong, no matter what anybody says. Well, it's not. It will boost your confidence to actually, now and again, just trace a line drawing. And then watercolour, coloured pencil, graphite, finish it in whatever medium you want, because you'll have a solid foundation then to apply your skills. And let's face it, that's where most of the work is, isn't it? You know, a line drawing is just a tenth really of the time spent and the effort spent on a drawing, although it's probably 90% the most important part. You know, it's a funny thing, isn't it? You know, it's the foundation of the drawing. So, you know, if you're planning on doing this in watercolour and you trace that line, you're going to have no problem with these textures. You're really not. So even a beginner, I mean, a beginner's probably looking at that picture now thinking, oh no, don't say that, John. A beginner can't do that, honestly. Yes, you can. You can. If you trace the lines, if you trace all these outlines, just the outlines, and then you go in and you start to draw the inner parts of the windows, you know, and you're putting all the details and everything, and you're putting all the textures and tones in, you know, these simple textures, you won't struggle. You're not going to struggle. Most beginners, I find, struggle with the line drawing, and they'll continue to finish the line drawing with all their lovely textures and tone work. They'll continue through, and the line drawing might be out. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. No, well done for persevering and you know, continuing on with the drawing. But if you can get the accuracy there from the start, you'll have the confidence there from the start, and you'll know that every pencil stroke that you're making on top of your outlines is a worthwhile one. You're not going to be sitting there drawing thinking, I know this area is out and it's not right. I don't know how to correct it, but I'm going to shade all this in and make it look lovely anyway. But the roof angles are out. You know, you're not faced with those kind of demoralising feelings, because it doesn't inspire you to carry on with the drawing or even continue with it in some cases. So sometimes to trace can be a good thing. I'm not trying to get on my high horse now and say I traced from my original pencil drawing, which I done with a grid method, or fair and square or anything like that. No, you know, if I was a beginner, and when I was a beginner, I used to trace. I used to trace things. It helped me to see the angles. Like if I'd have done my original pencil drawing and all the angles were wrong, what I would have done is gone and traced the drawing that I was copying from, and then I would have seen at the line drawing stage what I should have done. Those lines, and so they can sometimes feel unnatural for you to draw. As you're tracing and you look at it and think, I'd never have drawn it at that angle. Because line drawings can look different from the finished thing. You know, there's a lot of optical illusions going on in landscapes, you know, when they're covered in tones and colours and things like that. But when you see them naked in just their line drawing state, you know, they can really look different. And you'll look at it and think, well, I never realised that. You know, I was kind of drawing those lines in as I thought they were, but when I actually see the lines as I've traced them, they're totally different to how I originally saw them. And that can actually teach you a very valuable lesson about observation there. You know, not drawing what you think you're necessarily seeing, actually drawing what you are really seeing, and really seeing what those angles look like and what the proportions really are. You know, it's not something a be-all and an end-all. Obviously, if you want to get good at freehand drawing, tracing is definitely not the way to go. But to do it in the early stages and to boost your confidence now and again, if you've had a tricky line drawing or something like that, which I imagine this could be tricky for some people, some of these angles. I've not got them perfectly right at all. And I've changed a lot about this drawing. You know, a lot of it's wrong, but to me, it looks okay. So, you know, in the early stages, you know, something like this will be a really good drawing for you to trace, because you might struggle a little bit with the some of the angles and the perspective there. But please don't feel bad about it. There's no guilt, there's no shame or anything like that with tracing. There really isn't. There really isn't. But don't let it become a crutch. This is turning out to be more of a video about tracing, isn't it, than pencil and wash. But it's funny how one thing kind of leads on to another. But I'll just say the final word on it, and then I'm going to get on with the painting. Yeah, whatever happens, you know, trace and build your confidence up, but don't ever let it be a crutch. Don't ever let it be a crutch. Always try and do some freehand sketching. Try and use the grid method, because the grid method is kind of the halfway house between freehand drawing and tracing. It's still an aid, but you've got a lot of the work to do there with the grid method. You know, you really have. So your observation skills are going to play a big part with the grid method. Whereas, you know, regularly tracing and using it as a crutch, if you like, is not going to enhance your observation skills in the long run. It will initially. You'll get a very quick buzz from this. You'll learn a lot very quickly from tracing. Like I say, you'll understand angles and lines a lot better initially. But once you understand that, then start to use the grid method, and then start to, you know, do the freehand drawings if it makes you feel better, you know. But, you know, please have a go at this and trace. If you're looking at it thinking, I won't be able to do that, that's too complicated, well, just trace. Just trace and start to practice your textures and the pencil and wash technique. You've got nothing to lose, you've only got something to gain, you know. The experience of painting, the experience of doing the textures, you're bound to learn something and progress. So tracing initially has helped you in that respect. Okay. Right, if you need to know anything else about pencil and wash, or even tracing, I mean, I'll probably retitle this video now to pencil and wash and tracing or something like that, because I covered it quite exhaustively there. So, but if there's anything else you want to ask me about pencil and wash techniques and the differences between, you know, drawing or anything, if you want to ask me anything, just ask me. I'm always happy to help. You know, just ask a question and I'll get back to you. Okay, so I'm going to get on with the watercolour now, and obviously that's going to be a separate video. And yeah, okay, well, that's all I can say, isn't it? So I'll see you in the next one then. Bye for now.